Welcome back to Shoogly Shed Motors. We're back in the shed. London was an absolute blast. The bike shed show was awesome. Completely surpassed my expectations. Such a cool event. Nice to hang out with all these like-minded folk, and obviously really good to have a bike there. So we got there in the end, which felt a bit touch and go, getting the bike all together and getting the tank sorted and the seat and all that, all that ready in time. Into the trailer, down to London. Obviously I had the episode out last, but it was really nice just to get down there finally, get the bike on display, and then just relax for a while, enjoy the show, speak to people, have some drinks, and then get back up the road to Scotland, back in the shed, and actually think about trying to get this bike on the road next. So with that in mind, the main thing I need to do is wire it. I've kind of started some of the wiring just in order to make the bike look presentable for the show, but a lot of the wiring is just temporary and needs basically stripped back to the start and gone from there. We're obviously using the NWT X21 M, I think it is, the momentary buttons that we wired into the handlebars. So that should make our life a little bit easier, just running all the wires to the X21 module box, and then kind of going from there. So first things first, tank off, seat off, or seat off, tank off I should say, in that order. Put them somewhere safe, and then I'm going to spend a wee while basically stripping out the temporary solutions that I made like for the show, and then we can start actually putting wires in for permanent. Right, a quick chat about the wiring plan, because I don't think I've really mentioned much of it before. Obviously a while ago we made a battery box which has the Motobat battery in here. We've got the X21 on the little mounts in here. We also have the starter solenoid and the CDI ignition unit. Aside from that, obviously there's lights and things like that, but that's pretty much the majority of the electrical componentry control wise. Wires obviously need to be run from the front, where we've got the headlight and the indicators and things like that, and the switches at the top, the momentary switches, all the way to here. Currently they basically terminate under the tank, and that was just for the show. They all need to now run to the X21 unit. Things like battery cables and things all need to be run to the starter motor, and main earth for the engine, and then lights at the back need to be run into it as well. So there's a fair amount of work and wires to be run in various different directions. So I'm going to get my wiring kit out and make a start on trying to extend things that need to be extended, and routing other cables from this kind of cluster here down across the top, maybe across the top of the frame here and under and into my sort of electrical box inside and under the seat. Yeah, so without further ado, let's get into it. I'm not a huge fan of wiring, but it's not too bad. It's actually a lot easier with the little X21 unit. I just find it quite repetitive and quite monotonous. A lot of crimping connectors and things like that, and running cables, and you just need to switch your brain off for a while, get it all done, and then look forward to the fact you'll have a fully wired running bike at the end of it. Right, as is the case with quite a lot of sort of aftermarket electrical components, they come pre-fitted with these sort of bullet connectors and wires for extending them and connecting them into your own sort of wiring harness. Although there's nothing wrong with these, I'd like to make this a bit neater and put them all into block connectors, the Super Seal ones that I've used in the past. Once all of these are connected in, all of these and all of these, that's a pretty big chunky connection, which although is sort of user friendly, i.e. you can just, you know, plug and play, it's not the neatest solution for this bike, and I'm trying to keep everything as neat as possible. That was kind of the main aim with this bike from the start. So I'm going to chop all these connectors off and pin up some connector blocks for these, which I think will make it neater and actually even easier for plugging in and out, because it's just one connector block as opposed to what, like 12 or something there. So these will get chopped, these will get chopped. I'll perhaps use these wires for extending them just because I've got them. And then I've also got quite a lot of wires that are just terminated in random places that need extensions put onto them as well. I also need to extend some wires that are just terminated in random places and then decide where connector blocks are going to go. There's no point in running like a, for example, like a brake switch. There's no point in running a complete cable from the brake switch all the way to the X21, because if I ever needed to replace that, I'd need to cut the cable and splice into it. Whereas if I just make up a little connector block somewhere nice and neat, you can just unplug it and remove it and replace it. So that's probably the most neat solution, although it does take a little bit more time to put in all these connector blocks as opposed to just running cables in one complete run. However, it's the right way to do it, and that's the way I'm going to do it. The X21 also, because it has these connections, these little pin connections in here, it comes with your sort of pre-made up connector block there that will plug directly into that. So these wires here need to be wired into the componentry on the bike in order for it then to plug directly into the control box. So that is another thing to contend with, is whether or not I want to run these as complete cables to the components, or whether or not I want to again cut into these and splice in connector blocks to make, you know, replacing things in the future easier. Again, it takes more time, but it's probably the right way to do it. For some things I'm not going to worry too much, but for other little bits of componentry that wear over time and replaced or tested and things, that can also be a factor to think about. I'll probably try and put in connector blocks so they can be unplugged and plugged back in again. Right, I'm going to start out with the easy stuff, which is basically battery cables and starter motor cables. So obviously starter solenoid, this is the cable that I've already run to the starter motor, so that just needs to basically get bolted onto here, and then the other side is for the battery, so that just needs a cable going to the positive terminal of the battery, and then the negative terminal of the battery needs to go to a ground, a main ground. When I manufactured the frame and the modifications, I welded in some captive nuts that are acting as ground points. There's two here and one up the front as well. It helps with this kind of wiring system because a lot of things, just the positives go to the control unit, whereas the grounds just need to ground out to the nearest possible ground. So it's nice to have these. I've done that before on a couple of other builds as well. So they'll get grounded out to these, battery will get grounded out to this, and that basically makes the frame and the engine your one big ground, which is better than running ground cables all over the bike that aren't really necessary. So, like I say, bolt this into that, make up a cable for that to that, make up a cable for that to that, and just start from there. what I've done is I've picked out a little earth point on the engine casing down here. Nice and simple, very common. With the engine casing obviously being earthed, that means the starter motor is now earthed as well, because that's where it attaches. So now I obviously have a positive and a negative to go into my battery. So just going to pop the blocks, the threaded blocks, into the battery terminals like that. Negatives obviously over here. Screw that in. Nice and tight, and then positive over here. Nice and tight as well. The other thing I've got is this little earth point that I have crimped into this one, which I'm going to attach onto this welded earth point on my battery box. That again puts the earth from the battery, engine, frame all linked up in one, so that these earth points I have all work. Okay, so next thing I've done is plugged in the wires that come with the solenoid. One of these is going to go to the key switch, one of them to the alternator, and then these two here need to go directly into the X21 itself. So what I'm going to do is strip these back and connect them in to the ports on the side. And then one of these needs to go to the key switch, like I say, and the alternator one. I haven't quite figured out my routing for the wiring yet, but I'm just ticking off these as I go. The momentary switches that go to the handlebar, when you get that set from NWT, they have a little bit of heat shrink over these three connectors. That's basically to help you feed the cables through the handlebars. So I've just taken heat shrink off of them. Now you can see those three little micro connectors on each of these. Each one is for the left and right hand handlebar switches up here, and basically what you need to do is you need to get these little block connectors that come with the set and put these into the correct pins. And it does tell you on the NWT installation worksheet which pins to go in where, and it is quite important for the function. But yeah, basically once these are all the way threaded through, pop each of these three into their corresponding places in the block connector, and then it just plugs into the side of the unit. Right, so I've just basically been running more wires across the bike. Wiring a bike is just a bit like this, it's a bit bitty. There's a lot of little componentry that you can't, you know, miss out. You need to get all the wires to the right places. Trying to do it neatly as well takes a bit of time. What I'm going to do next is wiring the coils. If you don't know how coils are wired, it's quite simple. They get a power and a ground to each coil. They basically constantly have a power feed, and the ground is controlled by the CDI, your ignition unit. So when it wants to fire that particular cylinder that's the coil's connected to, it just grounds that one out, completes the circuit, and you get your spark. So this bike basically has two coils, basically firing two cylinders at a time. Grey and red with white tracer will do one, and orange and red with white tracer will do the other one. So these just need some connectors on the end, and then they can get plugged into the coils. Squish, squish. Heat shrink over the top. Bit of heat with the heat gun. So that's my two powers now. All I need to do is my grounds. The crimping tool that I'm using is just a very sort of generic, basic one. It's got strippers at the top and the different crimps in the middle. So I use the strippers to strip back the insulation on the wires, and then you basically use the crimping portion to crimp your connectors. Like that. Next thing I want to wire in is the CDI ignition unit. Now this is the stock plug for it. The ignition unit is obviously mounted on the bike, and this is the connector that it will basically be plugged in with. As you can see, it's a bit of a mess of wires. When I took this off the bike in the first place, I just cut it out the loom because I haven't got any of these connectors, and this is the only connector that will fit into the CDI. So I need to basically make use of these tails of wires here. As you can see, they're not in great condition. They're obviously been spliced and cut and melted in places. So I need to basically cut off as much as I can of the bad bits and then connect on new wires that these will then go into the rest of the loom. I have been running the wires, for example, like the coils you just saw, to the roughly where the CDI is. Those wires will just get spliced straight into the corresponding colours on this. So first of all, I'm going to basically try and pick off one by one which cable needs to get trimmed down and which needs to get connected in. There's also, confusingly, a couple of, three I think, different black wires. They're to do with, well, one of them's a ground, but the other two are to do with the alarm system that came stock on the bike, which I'm not using. So need to make sure that that's wired correctly so that the bike isn't immobilised. Yeah, it's a bit of a cluster bomb, this one, but we'll get around it. It's just a case of, you know, one wire at a time, and eventually it will hopefully work. I also meant to say, I've got my wiring diagram from NWT now. That's the kind of whole thing there. I don't know if you've seen one of these before, but effectively, if we zoom in a little bit, there's my X21 unit, all the wires going from it to my different componentry on the bike. There's my speedometer up there, tail lights, indicators, battery, solenoid, all these things. So here's my CDI, zoom in, there. So the CDI now obviously needs all those wires I've just shown you spliced into the rest of the loom. I've got my pickups and my throttle position sensor and things, all those wires and the coils there, they're all run to the CDI, they just need to be connected in. Right, it's not very pretty, but that's them all wired in. This is a ground connection that I'm just going to bolt onto one of my ground points and then plug it in, and then I can sort of tuck all the wires and neaten them up a little bit. But that is more or less all the ignition timing wires connected up to the block connector for the CDI. Alright, so with the CDI all wired in and plugged in, just going to lift the X21 out so I can show you a bit better. Down this side of it, all these block connectors here, screw connectors, sorry, these are more or less all your lights. Effectively, the way this unit works is all your lights get grounded out to the frame, and then the power basically comes from this module. And that means that you can control these lights with those little momentary switches on the handlebars. It's actually quite smart, and the way it does it is pretty intelligent, but all I need to do then is run singular power wires from these connectors here across the bike to the headlights, the front indicators, the tail lights and the rear indicators, and then they all need separately grounded as well, which is again why I put grounding points at other points on the frame. So I'm going to put in wires from this to all those components and then connect them in situ and put their grounds where they need to be as well, and then that will basically be the lighting for the bike all wired into the unit. Right, so that's the rear basically wired now. That's the light cluster for the indicators and tail lights and plate light coming in under here. The NWT X21 now has all of its connections plugged in. The CDI, solenoid, battery, etc. all those cables are now finished. You know, it's fairly neat as far as wiring jobs go. I'm pretty pleased with that. Big thanks to the NWT unit for that kind of neatness, because it does simplify a wiring loom quite substantially. I now have this big melange of wires running to the front of the bike that need connected up. They're basically going to the speedometer and the headlight. That's basically it. And the front indicators. But easy peasy basically. Everything else is connected up, throttle position sensors connected up, coils, neutral switch, oil switch, pickup, all those things are all wired in now. It's literally just the front lights and the speedometer to do. So although it looks like a lot of cables, it's actually just a case of just joining them where they need to go. Not much more thinking involved. So yeah, wire strippers again, and my heat shrink and my heat gun, and just keep on doing it. We're almost there. We're getting there with this, and at the end of the day with wiring, it is just a case of turning your brain off sometimes and get on with it. It can feel like quite a daunting task, but you just need to plod on. So that's the wiring finished on the bike. The one problem I'm having is the gauge, the speedometer up here isn't turning on. I have power to the connector, so the wiring from the NWT unit is correct. I've got power and a ground. Even if I use my power probe and put 12 volts to the speedo, it won't turn on. So that's pointing towards a bit of a faulty unit, in my opinion. So I've contacted the manufacturer where I purchased this from, see if they can offer any advice, and if not, perhaps replace the unit, which is a bit frustrating because I wanted to get it all working now, but you know, it's a start at least to get all the wiring run and connected up and finished off. Aside from that, key switch works, so when I turn it on, the NWT unit is operating my lights. All my brake lights work, my indicators and things all work nicely. My horn works fine. So everything else works fine. If I turn the engine kill switch on and turn the engine over, that also works. I don't want to turn the engine over too much yet because I want to do the valve gaps, the valve clearances, which I haven't done yet. So that's basically my next job, now that I've finished the wiring, is to do the valve gaps on the head, just to make sure that I'm 100% happy with them. They'll probably need done again after a little bit of bedding in, because obviously I've relapped all the valves and things, so they'll settle in. So they'll need checked after a couple hundred miles of riding. And then also I need to rebuild the carbs properly, because if you remember correctly, I just did a sort of aesthetic upgrade on these with fresh bolts and paint and things for the bike shed show. But these need to get stripped down and rebuilt properly with cleaning the jets or new jets and valves, needles, valves and all those kind of bits and pieces. Aside from that, very, very close to getting this bike firing up for the first time, which is quite exciting. The wiring was a big job to get out of the way, and now that 95% of that is done, bar the speedometer, I can probably get the carbs off next, get them rebuilt, do the valve gaps, and then go for a first start, which is quite exciting. Anyway, as usual, please do give me a like, leave me a comment, and subscribe to the Shoogly Shed channel. I appreciate everyone's support getting this bike over the finish line. We're nearly there. We're nearly there. I can't wait to take this out on the road. It's going to be cool. Anyway, take care. Goodbye. With the engine casing obviously being earthed, that means the starter motor is now earthed as well, because that's where it attaches.